Joining us today. Thank you very much for joining us today to discuss some new research on the public servant's role in democracy. This will be a presentation by Brendan Boyd, Associate Professor of MacEwan University. And unfortunately, Jared Wesley, who is the other co-author on this research, is unable to join us today. So before I begin with some instructions and introductions, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, as we are located here in Alberta, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, and the Tsuut'ina, and the Lahehe Dakota First Nations. Also, this is home to Métis Nation homeland, Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. As well, as our presenter is from Northern Alberta in Edmonton, we would like to acknowledge Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and the traveling route to the Cree, the Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Dakota Sioux First Nations. Please keep in mind the traditional peoples of your home area as we engage together today. So I would like to now introduce Brendan Boyd. He is a former member of the IPAC Calgary Regional Group and is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology, Economics, and Political Science at MacEwan University. His research interests include learning in public policy, Canadian climate policy, and the role of the public service in policymaking. He has recently co-edited the book, Provincial Policy Laboratories, Policy Diffusion and the Transfer in Canada's Federal System. So today, because we are a small group, Brendan will be presenting and we'll be sharing his screen with slides. But at this point, you can put questions in the Q&A or the chat function, or raise your hand as we move through the presentation. And at the end, we hope to have a discussion where all of us can come on screen. So over to you, Brendan.
Thanks, Jackie, for that. And thanks everybody for attending today and taking the time out of your busy day to hear about this research and discuss this research. I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to talk about some of the things that we've been working on. So I will get right to it. So as we all know, the context of public servants in which they do their job is changing or has changed. And the impact of this and how public servants and how governments respond to this has been debated for years now. But most of the research that's out there, the academic research that is out there, usually uses or is based on interviews with high-ranking officials like public servants, oftentimes retired public servants, or case studies of important events or events that really demonstrate a particular issue. And so in this literature, you really get sort of, and beyond, you get two different roles sort of put out there for the public service. You have the traditional sort of impartial, nonpartisan, and anonymous civil servant. And then more recently, you have the sort of dynamic public-facing manager that's out there. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to engage with a larger section of the individuals currently working in the public service. And so we engaged with IPAC to send out a survey to IPAC membership. And we used a panel of public servants that had been convened by a colleague at UBC to send out a survey asking them questions about their role in democracy. And so we had 1,250 about responses from public servants. And we essentially asked some questions about how do they view their role in democracy? How do they view their job? And a bunch of questions related to that overarching theme. The other thing that we wanted to do was, thinking about more broadly the context in which public servants operate, thinking about sort of the lack of trust in traditional political institutions that's emerged over the last decade, maybe longer, the emergence of populist movements politically, and public servants obviously aren't immune to these forces and again get lumped in with the sort of populist rhetoric. So we wanted to look at how does the general public view public servants and their role in democracy? And obviously, in terms of sort of arguments that are out there about, the increased politicization or pressure for politicization and to be more responsive, for public servants to be more responsive to government's agenda, we wanted to look at politicians' views of the public servant as well to get a sense of whether this was something that was actually occurring or how politicians' views stacked up against this sort of argument that had been made by, Peter Aucoin, to a lesser extent, Donald Savoy and people like that. And so we worked with CDEM to get 1,500 members of the general public surveyed, and we worked with the Samara Institute and we got just under 80 responses from federal MPs to our survey. And so the last thing that we wanted to ask, we wanted to obviously compare those perceptions to those of public servants themselves. The last thing we wanted to ask was, how do all of these things conform to what we understand as traditional principles of Canadian executive government in a Westminster system? And so things like ministerial responsibility, the notion of the politics administrative dichotomy, and the public service bargain that's outlined by Savoy and, has been a fairly important sort of tool or concept for understanding executive governance relations in Canada. So testing some of those conceptual and theoretical aspects as well against what public servants said. So, sorry, skip past a slide there. Okay, so first question we wanted to focus on was the idea of nonpartisanship. And so we asked two questions. The first one we asked was whether ensuring an effective and legitimate government required that public servants remain nonpartisan when they're at work. And so you can see that public servants overwhelmingly agreed that they supported the idea of nonpartisanship in the public service. The general public also strongly supported that idea, but politicians were actually split. And so that supports, to me, that's some evidence to support the notion that public servants may be being asked by politicians to more enthusiastically endorse policy and buy into the government's mandate to a greater extent than previous. Of course, we have to ask the question, did politicians ever support the nonpartisan public service? Because this is just a snapshot in time, right, of when we did our data. So we also do have a historical project where we're looking through parliamentary records and bringing out speeches and debates on public service that have happened in Parliament to try to get a sense of the historical context as well. The other question that we asked was, and this kind of relates more to the politics administrative dichotomy, or the separation between politics and administration, is whether should public servants focus exclusively on administrative matters and leave politics to the elected officials. And so in this case, fewer public servants and the public, although still a strong majority, believe that public servants should actually be completely removed from politics. But over 2/3 of politicians disagreed with this. And this again reinforces, I think, the idea that there's some pressure for public servants to be at least more responsive to the agenda of the political side of the executive branch. So one of the things that we're interested in is that we're going to sort of work on in focus groups and in interviews is, what exactly do people understand when we say politics, right? Are they thinking about partisan politics, or are they thinking more broadly about being aware of the political environment and context in which they work? And so that's something that we're going to explore further in focus groups and interviews. But what this kind of tells us is that politicians are offside with the traditional notion of the impartial public servant, and also what public servants see as their role and what the public expects from public servants. Oops. The other question we asked was, similarly, we asked whether public servants needed to remain nonpartisan outside of their work hours in their private lives. And you can see, interestingly, that 85% of politicians agreed that public servants should be nonpartisan in their private life, whereas the general public is essentially split or close to being split, and public servants disagreed, 72% of them disagreed that they need to be nonpartisan in their private lives. And so again, this is interesting. It shows that there's a bit of a misunderstanding on the part of politicians about public servants' rights to be involved in, political activity in their private lives, which are, typically outlined or, formally dealt with in public service codes of conduct. And so it seems that there's, at least to some extent, that politicians don't trust public servants to leave their personal views at home. Now, one of the things that we're thinking about is the extent to which this extends to social media and whether politicians might be thinking specifically about public servants' use of social media, as this is still sort of a gray area that hasn't been well defined, I think, and people are still getting used to in terms of public servants using social media in their private lives, but then obviously something is on the public record, is out there on internet, and they may not be able to be anonymous because people can potentially find out that they work for government. And so that might be sort of one of the issues that plays into some of this. But generally, you see, it's a little bit surprising to me that politicians didn't have more support for the idea that outside of their work life, public servants are, engaged in political activity on a personal level. Oops. Okay, so the next thing that we looked at was anonymity. And so whether public servants should be anonymous and not subject to public scrutiny. And surprisingly to me, only 42% of public servants agreed that they should be anonymous and free from public scrutiny. The general public was similar, around 38%, but over 56% of politicians agreed with the concept of public service anonymity. We also asked whether it was part of a public servant's job to talk to media and stakeholders to kind of get a more practical sense of what that means rather than the theory or concept. And you can see that 100% of politicians, as well as majorities of the other two groups, believe that it was a public servant's job to talk to media. So our conclusion there is that there's just not a lot of support for the idea of anonymity of the public servant coming from our survey. I wanted to show this slide here where we break out public servants according to the number of years that they've served. So this is specifically public servants broken out by their position, whether they're in management, senior manager, executive manager, or not in management, and then by their years of service. And so we looked at the question of whether public servants should focus exclusively on administrative matters. And so my assumption here was that the higher level of public servants who work more with politicians would say that public servants had to be aware of the political context and had to have some role in politics. But the pattern that you see is actually the opposite. 73% of senior officials agreed that public servants should focus only on administration, while only about half of those not in management agreed. So perhaps this is explained by the need for more senior politicians to stay out of actual politicking and partisan campaigning. And so they're more aware of that line and that distinction. Again, that's something we're going to sort of work on with focus groups and interviews to help determine how people are defining politics when they're answering these questions. But one of the things that we did have, I don't have the slide, but we have another some information where we asked public servants whether they felt it was important or whether they agreed with the statement that public servants needed to understand current political events to do their job properly. And there was pretty strong support amongst public servants that, that was something public servants needed to do. So that suggests that maybe they're answering this question. When people answer the previous question about administration and political matters, they're thinking more about, sort of partisan politicking. Okay, so one of the things we wanted to test again was sort of the idea of responsibility and accountability. And so we asked who's primarily responsible when something goes wrong. You can see here, interestingly, that politicians said that elected officials, as well as the media, were mostly to blame, whereas public servants said officials and everyone equally were their choices in terms of who's primarily responsible, whereas the general public, similarly to politicians, said elected officials and the media. And so what this suggests, I guess, probably unsurprisingly, is that there is strong distrust of the media. That idea is sort of present and real in our findings. The other thing I guess it suggests, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a second, is the idea of ministerial responsibility potentially stays intact here, in the sense that politicians are, by and large, the largest group that is blamed if something goes wrong or deemed to be responsible. And finally, just highlighting that almost 10% of public servants said that senior public service leaders were primarily responsible, which I think is an interesting finding as well, one that didn't show up with the other groups. Okay, so I'll get to some conclusions before we kind of open this up to a broader discussion. But going back to sort of the questions that I posed at the start, one of the things that I think we found was that public servants, in terms of what public servants, how they view their role, that public servants had a lot of support for nonpartisanship, but not as much support for the idea of an anonymous public servant. And so to me, there's not a real clear answer or a straightforward answer coming out of this data about whether public servants view themselves in that traditional model that we associate with the civil servant, or whether they have moved on and see themselves as sort of the more public-facing dynamic manager. The real important question here, I think, for me is, are the idea of the concept of nonpartisanship and the concept of a public profile compatible? If you're a public figure, if you're more public-facing as a public servant, are you inevitably getting drawn into partisan or political disputes, or can you still avoid those? So perhaps this is where some of the tension comes from. But if we're looking at how public servants view themselves, there seems to be some sense that they can not necessarily be as anonymous as they have previously, but still maintain nonpartisanship. So I think exploring that is going to be interesting as to whether that's actually possible, the extent to which it's possible. In the second question, we asked, whether public servants' views, to what extent they corresponded to those of politicians and the public. Well, the general public generally has similar views to public servants, is what we found, but politicians do not. And so in some ways, it's encouraging that the general public kind of, to a certain extent, understands or values the tradition, like the role of the public servant, but the politicians seem to want more responsiveness in terms of their day-to-day work, but also are concerned about public servants' political activities outside of work. Probably the good thing is that politicians do see themselves as primarily accountable when things go wrong, or primarily responsible. And so what that means is, kind of getting into our third question, or the third question that I proposed, is that ministerial responsibility seems to be intact. All groups supported the notion that politicians are primarily responsible. In terms of the politics administration dichotomy, or the idea of the separation of administration and politics, there was some support from public servants and the general public, which was somewhat interesting because, again, it's kind of long been understood that a complete separation between these two things is not really possible in practice, and probably not desirable. So I have to admit that I was a bit surprised to see public servant support for the separation of these two things. And then finally, the public service bargain, or the idea of sort of the tacit understanding between public servants and politicians, and the trade-offs that they give each other to create the role of the public servant, was not really supported by politicians. And really, it was only nonpartisanship that was supported by the public service and the general public. So that leads, in my mind, to some support for the idea of, that's been put out there by Savoy, and that this bargain is breaking down, and the sort of the traditional notion of the public servant is at least under stress to some degree. So I put up my contact here, as well as my Twitter account, as well as the website where you can go to see our research note on this and the original article that we did. I also put down the name of my research team members. You can see who they are and where they're from as well. So yeah, if anyone wants to get in contact, obviously outside of this, that would be great. But I'm hoping now that we could turn this over to questions and discussion.
Great. So Brendan, do you want to stop sharing your screen and we can I'll come on screen?
I can, if people want to raise their hand to jump up to ask you a question, or they can put it in the Q&A, either or. I can do that, and I will move them to the screen.
So do we have any questions?
We have one popping up right now.
All right, so
David is coming up to ask a question.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Great presentation. Thank you, Jackie, for organizing this. Brendan, I worked in the Ontario government for 33 years, 16 as an ADM. And I must say, I was always surprised at the number of public servants who were cheerleaders for a particular government and opposed to other governments. And I personally, found this unacceptable. And I think part of it is that, people join the government, and perhaps when they join and they take their oath, that they don't receive proper training, or that time goes by and they're not reminded about their obligations and duties to remain independent. And then, of course, with the introduction of social media, that's another aspect. So maybe you could comment on your thoughts just around, the lack of training or knowledge, the introduction of new ways in which public servants have access or can influence. When I joined government, it was over 35 years ago, we had a green screen or an orange screen. And if you wanted to undermine the government, it would be in a brown envelope that, would be going. Completely different world now. So just your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. And so, obviously, at the federal level, you have this sort of Trudeau getting elected in 2015 and public servants clapping, right? When he came in, and incidences like that. It's interesting, like where I am in Alberta, of course, we had long periods of progressive conservative governments. And so it actually, to a certain extent worked a little bit the other way, in the sense that the public service here had to learn to work with an NDP government that they, of course, had never worked with before when they won power in 2015. So to me, it's part of it is just the familiarity of when you have longer periods of government. In Ontario, that would be a little bit different because there hasn't been, the same, not like Alberta, where there's been, like 30 years or 3 decades of uninterrupted PC governments. So one of the things I've been thinking, we kind of asked, and I wanted to get at was, is this a generational thing? Because part of my thinking was that, and I'm not being negative at all about, different generations or anything like that, but whether there was a more activist bent to people working on public policy that would then get into the public service and be frustrated, right? Frustrated by some of these other things. That didn't really bear out in our evidence and in the data that we showed. It wasn't as pronounced as I thought it would be, or as significant. So yeah, it's interesting. I guess one of the things I think is so if it's not as much a generational thing, I wonder, I've always thought that it has to potentially do with discipline, in the sense that if you have an economist, or if you have, someone coming in as an expert in their field, and then they could go to the private sector or the public sector, and they decide to go to the public sector, they don't necessarily have that training, right? So whether it's accountants, economists, any kind of specialization. Whereas if you come through a public policy degree or a public administration master's, which are becoming more and more common, you do kind of learn that stuff. So I wonder if that's where the division is, and then there needs to be some sort of more training within government for the people that don't necessarily come from MPA programs or MPP programs. Just right. That's because I worked for the government for 4 years before I went into academia, and I don't think I got any of that training. It all came from my degree, like when I was in university, and I was part of like a little program that was supposed to be sort of fast tracking management people in the province of Manitoba. So yeah, I think more work needs to be done, and not assuming that everyone's coming in with the MPP or the MPA program that would teach them.
Well, I also think of the literally tens of thousands, if not, a couple 100,000 of people who've been hired during the pandemic, the past 2 years. I mean, how many of those, took the oath and were given the proper training and are aware of this? And, will managers have an opportunity to catch up to that? Will they address that? I mean, it sounds like there's an opportunity here, Jackie, for IPAC to step up and help. But I was always surprised that people, who worked in public service thought it was okay, to openly just criticize the government of the day and then to cheer on another government, when that's not really the rule. I mean, the rule to me is to provide, the best advice independently and to support the government. So anyhow, I just wanted to share that because I feel that more can be done. And I think if more is done, it might help improve the overall image of public servants in terms of being, neutral.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it also, so the overall image, it would be improved. I also think like there is some of the stuff I've seen on job satisfaction is that the younger generations do have a higher dissatisfaction with their job in the public service. And I just wonder if some of that is the frustration of being told that, you're out there to make a difference. You can make a difference. You're going to make a difference. You're going to change the world. And then you come into government and you're hit with the realities of, well, you might be working for a government that doesn't have the same view as you on this particular issue. And then it leads to some sort of frustrations. I spend a lot of time with my students talking about, the value of, being able to work in that environment and work across multiple governments rather than, I guess that's an important part of the system rather than just focusing on the, solving this particular issue or that type of thing, So yeah, it's a big conversation. It's not easy, but I think there is more room for training within government because not everyone gets it in university, like has that training in university.
Thank you.
So Brendan, I have a question. Mm-hmm. In terms of government, your sample was mostly federal government politicians, you said. Do you think you'd find the same thing at the provincial level or at the municipal level?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know. Let me just check if I can see what our breakdown was because we went to IPAC and so it was IPAC members, and we do have. I think we do probably have the breakdown. I won't take a bunch of time to try to find it if I can't find it right now. So I'm not sure for sure that we do have a sample that's weighted more towards federal government. But still, your question was about whether we might find something different if we went to the provincial public service, if they were focusing exclusively on them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure whether we would find anything different. I know that I'm wondering if it's potentially like the issues that we were just discussing with David there in terms of understanding the role. My sense is that it might be more less of a problem, I guess, in the federal public service. There might be more understanding of the public services role or more sort of commitment to it, but that's not necessarily based on anything other than my own sort of intuition off the top of my head. So yeah, I don't know that I have a good answer for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I worked in the provincial government and in human resources. So certainly code of conduct was part of, the program that we would roll out from time to time. And depending on the kind of the significant issues, we would put more emphasis or less emphasis. So everybody was supposed to, understand what the code of conduct meant, but until actual instances or deviation from the code happened, it probably didn't get a lot of attention. And,
right.
And so I think that you're right. And very few of the people that we hired probably came from the kinds of backgrounds educationally where they had that in school. And it's certainly in the world of human resources, it never ceases to amaze you what people think is right or the kind of situations they find themselves in. But certainly, I think that the issue of, whose side am I on and what is my role is a big one. And people probably don't think about that until something goes wrong.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, you're right. I think it's hard to be proactive as opposed to reactive, I guess. And yeah, I think to me, like, my sense is from students, and I'm just talking to public servants in general, that there's providing the frank and fearless advice is not a problem as much as what do you do when it doesn't go forward, right? When you put your advice forward or you have an idea and it doesn't, government moves somewhere else and they don't act on it, then how do you continue? Maybe that happens numerous times over the course of, your career, and so how do you stay motivated and satisfied in a context like that when, you're sort of had the idea that you're there to potentially change things or, to make a difference. Mm-hmm. When you're contributing to the system and playing a super important role, is obviously evidenced by the fact that we're studying this. I truly believe that, but that it's a little more, your contribution is a little more nuanced and not as straightforward and maybe not as easily quantified, I guess, or visible. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how to convey that, because obviously I'm, talking to students and convincing them that the public service is a career that they should be pursuing, right?
Right. I think Matthew had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Thanks for the conversation. Brendan, Matthew Cutler, I'm an assistant deputy minister in your former public service, in the Manitoba Public Service.
Oh, great.
And the research is really interesting. I appreciate the graphs. It's really given me some pause and things to think about. A couple observations and then something for you to reflect on. I mean, the first thing, Jackie pointed out this difference between orders, and I spent 10 years in the municipal order working in the Toronto Public Service before coming here. I think there is a fundamental difference about how people practice that administrative policy or administrative political paradigm in municipal orders when you're not dealing with cabinet governance, you're dealing with a council of the whole, strong mayors maybe, but still a sense that you need to go in front of an entire council or committee and that there's some strength to that as opposed to the nature of how cabinet decision-making is made. So there may be some nuances there. I'm curious though about that paradigm and your thoughts around sort of the dichotomy of administration and politics, because I could see a lot of confusion in that space amongst public servants, right? And you alluded to some of this. We've been doing some additional work trying to fill in that training gap that you had talked about when you were back in Manitoba, and really talking more about what we think and believe. I think that Professor Group's work out of Cambridge, Megaphone Bureaucracy was his popular work, really started to call into question our role in public, how we account for ourselves, and that mix between, I think you referred to it as Washminister, right? This idea that public servants in the US are far more expected to account for their work. And Westminster, it's always been this anonymity, but that's changing and what this mixed role looks like. I feel like though the term politics itself in that dichotomy you present confuses public servants in its own way. So I'm curious about how you define that for respondents, and also where you see the conversation about administration versus politics evolving or changing, because I think there may be a paradigm between administration and policy, and then partisanship goes a bit further than that. And folks may be confusing the nuance between what is politic and what is partisan, and that there's a bit of a dance there. So I'm curious for your thoughts in that space.
Yeah, okay. So I think in terms of how we explained it to people, I think the short answer is we didn't really at this point. We didn't have a lot of, just for saving space and the sort of the practical aspects of survey work. We tried to not spend a ton of time with a bunch of writing that would, turn people off and potentially cut down on our uptake. So we didn't spend a lot of time. What we are planning to do is to use these results in focus groups and interviews. I think I mentioned that briefly, is that we're going to use these results to explore what things like politics means to people. And I kind of alluded to, like, is this, and you said this exactly, that it could be that people are thinking more about like partisan politics versus the more broad, like what I would call political acumen, of being aware of the political conditions, and how that side of government works. So that's going to be something that we explore more in focus groups and interviews with more public servants. So, I mean, I would say stay tuned on that one, because I don't have an answer. But I appreciate your comment that could be confusing to public servants. And I think that is something that we need to clarify. And just to say that we are going to be doing what I'd like to do, or what we're ideally hoping to do, is to establish this as a regular survey that we do at times, so that we can start to track it longitudinally and see how things change over time. And so obviously this is an iterative process that we would then refine the survey. So yeah, so your approach is, or your question there, or your comment is really valuable. I don't have, we didn't actually have like a clear sense of what public servants thought of when we asked them about the administrative dichotomy.
Great. So I think David has a question.
Thanks. If you're in the management group in certain governments across Canada, and you leave the public service, then you have a period where you can't join that sector, and then eventually you can, and you have to file the paperwork for potential conflict of interest. Would it make sense to have something similar, so that people can't go from the minister's office to the next day in joining the bureaucracy?
Yeah, so my understanding is that used to be a thing, right? And maybe you know more than I do, but that used to be, at least I think at the federal level, it used to be there was a cooling off period before, someone on the political side and the political staff could move into the bureaucracy, and then that got axed, or at least cut down. I think so that, yeah, it's always that balance, right? You want to have a responsive public service that is able to implement the mandate of the day. And to a certain extent, the distrust that politicians might have of the public service is partly due to their inability to get in some of the people that they would like to get in. But what you don't want is obviously the US style, I think anyways, what I don't think we want is the US style, sort of full scale shift, right? Of multiple layers down being replaced with different people. So to the extent that it can prevent that and having a cooling off period, I think that would make sense. It's just a matter of finding that balance so that it doesn't become as much of a, the internal organization of the 50s and 60s, where it was, the bureaucracy was the bureaucracy, and it was very cut off from society, people working in different disciplines and working in different sectors. I don't think we want to go to that, but I think finding some balance where, to avoid having the US style system is definitely important. So to the extent that it contributes to that, I would say, yes, it's a valuable thing to explore.
Thank you.
So Brendan, was there anything that totally surprised you in doing this research that you didn't expect to see at all?
I see Matthew has his hand up there. Was that from before, or did you have another question or another comment? Sorry, I just don't want to miss anybody.
I mean, I can go with another one, but if you want to answer Jackie's question first, I can jump in after.
Why don't we go with yours, and then I'll answer that
Sure.
I'll answer Jackie's question right at the end.
Yeah.
So a couple observations that just in this conversation that I'm curious for your comment on. So, you talk. David asked the question about ministerial staff. I've heard political staff referred to in various ways, but the reality is they don't have a place in the Constitution. They're sort of these actors who exist in the margins of our reality, but they play really powerful roles and play a big piece in this. So I'm curious about that. And the other piece, which you may remember from your time in Manitoba, and maybe some of your longitudinal or deeper work might help us get at this, is about the cultural and ritualistic things we do to define these cultures or these relationships. So in the case of Manitoba, I think about the fact that deputy ministers' offices are in the legislative building adjacent to ministers' offices with a door that connects them, in the same building where MLAs have their offices and caucus operations work. And so the geography of our provincial public service, including cabinet office in that building as well, I should add, lends itself to a closer relationship, not only to politic, but also to capital P politics or partisanship, right? You're in this environment where a lot is happening all at once. And it's not, the Ontario model where a DMO might be some distance, in fact, from a minnow and they don't go near Queen's Park. And so I'm curious about the ways in which we could better understand some of those cultural or other realities that enforce this. Because I think you pointed out rightly education and how we orient people, how we bring them into the oath. David's talked a bit about policy, things like the cooling off period. But I feel like there are a lot of other factors that reinforce to us on a daily basis who we are and the role we play. And I feel like some of us are doing better or worse at that than others. And there may be some key learnings there.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really interesting. Thinking just about geography, I mean, I guess my sort of researcher brain thinks the first thing to do would be to have a study of what that geography looks like across provinces, right? Like we always have this nice little comparative study that we can set up in Canada where we look at all the provinces. So to see, yeah, like the difference between Ontario and Manitoba, is it simply a size thing or the bigger provinces, the 4 big provinces have more staff, and so there's more space that's kind of separate and separated, or is there actually, or is it more depending on the preferences of the government and the culture and sort of the way things have evolved in each province? So I mean, I think that's a really interesting study that could be done. And I think we can't discount some of those things that are maybe a little more ingrained, a little more unconscious, that reinforce, the different relationships that politicians have with public servants. So yeah, I think that's something that could definitely be studied. That's an interesting one. Yeah, in terms of the political staff, like obviously everyone will know that this is something going back to the Gomery Inquisition that has been a big issue. And there was a paper as part of that Inquisition, there was a big paper written on political staff. And obviously Jonathan Kraft, who's another professor who's looked at the role in policy making of these political staff. And it's the fact that it's not well defined in terms of their role is, I think, a big problem. It leads to some of the increased partisan and rhetoric that exists, and it just hurts the public dialogue outside of government, even just more broadly. Like some of these staff are quite active on Twitter, and to me, it's just not always a super helpful role in terms of contributing to the public debate on these issues. So yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously been an issue for a while, but I don't know that it's something that anyone has a lot of clear answers for at this point. And then, sorry, the last thing, Matthew, I wanted to just touch on your point about municipalities. That is something that we'd like to do as we continue to evolve this, is to expand to include more of the municipal order of government, just because exactly like you said, there's a very different dynamic when you've got, a different governance system and a council of the whole versus cabinet government. And so it would be really interesting to explore those things. So maybe should I I can pick up on your question, Jackie, about the surprises if you wanted.
Sure. Does anybody else have a question before we go to that one?
Yeah, I guess we're getting
close to
somewhat close to the end.
Yeah. Oh, I think I have a question here. Let me just look. Yes, Yasmin has a question. Do you want to come on screen, or do you want me to ask the question?
I think she put it in the Q&A for you to you to ask.
All right. So, are there some areas open for further research with respect to public servants' role in Canadian democracy? Is her question?
Yeah. So my short answer would be absolutely. Like that's what we're doing. This is a SSHRC-funded project that we started, and we're hoping to expand it within Canada, and maybe even expand it to compare across other countries. But there's lots more room to explore different questions. We're going to be doing another survey in Alberta, hopefully in the next couple of months. And then we'll be looking for trying to set up sort of a more ongoing cross Canada survey in the future. Some of that depends on, funding and that type of thing, but yes.
Yeah. So how will you be doing the survey in Alberta?
So it's part of, so Jared Wesley has a regular sort of survey that he does called Viewpoint Alberta. And so that one will be of the public, again, asking questions of the public about their, perceptions of the public service. One of the things will be interesting, this was done pre-pandemic. One of the things we'll be interested in is whether the perception has changed post-pandemic. You think about chief medical health officers and the top sort of officials that have become very publicly prominent, and in some cases have become sort of, symbols of perseverance through the pandemic, but in other cases have taken some, become part of the regular controversy. And so how has that affected people's role in public service? As well, obviously, frontline healthcare workers have been a big part of this. We're kind of more looking at the core public service at this point, but whether there's a broader sort of change in how the public views the public servants is something that we'll be looking for. And then so what we'd like to do is do another round of actual public servants as well too at some point before too long, and then again we'll have some pre and post pandemic data, which should be interesting.
Hopefully that answered your question, Yasmin.
And I guess I would just say, if anyone is interested in sort of getting, involved, or at least, getting connected so that they can make sure that they, see all the stuff that's coming out. You can obviously, my contact information is on that last slide there, but you can also just find me at MacEwan University, where my email is, or Dr. Wesley at University of Alberta to email us to see what's going on, and you can look on his Common Ground, Dr. Wesley's Common Ground website. That's the project that he's running for briefing notes and articles and that kind of thing. Hopefully we that we can continue to interact with people as we go forward and shape some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So I think that is the last of the questions. So if you want to, oops, wait a minute, let me just check. Yasmin says thank you. So if you want to answer my question about the surprise, what you thought?
Yeah, sure. So I think the biggest surprise to me, and maybe this is my own naivety, I'm not sure, but it was surprising to me that politicians didn't understand or didn't support the idea of public servants having, political activity in their private life. And I'm not sure if, as I said, I'm not sure if they're thinking about social media and the concerns about that has really characterized their thinking on this. But those are some pretty, I would say, hard fought rights that public servants have won over time, is the ability to you know, to be able to participate in the political process outside their jobs. And so it was surprising to me that politicians didn't support that or didn't seem to get that. And I think that that's potentially an issue or a problem. So I talked a little bit about, you know, as David mentioned, education for public servants. I always think, although they have a lot on their plate, but if anyone's read Tragedy in the Commons from the Samari Institute that surveyed a bunch of politicians, is there's not a great understanding of their role as parliamentarians, and that the parties actually provide most of the education that new MPs or new MLAs get when they come in. And so, you know, I think part of a better training for new MPs and MLAs and elected officials about what their role is as a legislator, not as a member of the party, but, you know, and having attachment to that institution. And with that comes respect for the relationship with public servants, right? It's something that I really think is important. Paul Thomas, who I think probably Matthew will know, and maybe everyone will know, but at University of Manitoba, who's a, you know, sort of a long sort of well-respected public administration expert in Manitoba and Canada and beyond, always talked about a school for politicians that would explain their role as parliamentarians or legislators, and their, as well, including their relationship with the public service. And I think that's quite needed today, maybe more so than, you know, even when Paul first brought it up a decade or so ago.
Right. Yes, I think you're right. And everything just moves so quickly that there seems not to be time to pay attention to these important, yet maybe not the most important issues until, again, there's a problem and, you know, there's a bad outcome or there's not a very good outcome. So, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll just ask for last questions if there are any. Getting some good thank yous here, Brendan. Great session. It's a comment. So I really want to thank you very, very much for making yourself available today. You can let Jared know that we missed him. But perhaps once you do this second step of the focus groups and the one-to-one interviews, you can come back and, you know, we can talk about this again, because I think this issue of trust and relationships, as you say, post-pandemic will be one that we will need to turn our minds to for sure in the whole area of public administration, because I think there's been lots of shifts, and we'll see if those things shift back or where the next iteration takes us. So,
yeah, absolutely.
So any last comments?
No, none for me, other than just, you know, please feel free to reach out and get in touch with me if you have ideas or thoughts or questions or just want to know what we're up to. We really want to make sure that we're connected with the people that are, you know, working and understand this stuff as part of our research, so that it's meaningful and useful and you know, accurate to people's experience as well.
Great. And thank you, Aaron, for helping us from the IPAC National Office. And everyone, have a good day. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.